Chief. Thank you, team, for all of your work and continued work in this very challenging but necessary policy revision and process revision. At this time, our Chief Finance Officer, the great Green Tide, Mike Burt, and Heather Knust, our Budget Director, will have a brief budget workshop.
Okay, good afternoon. Today's workshop really kicks off the FY21 budget development process. It's our first leg of a 9-month budget odyssey that will wrap up in September with final adoption. Ms. Knust, we're going to do our best to contain our enthusiasm and get through this presentation quickly. We want to give you a little background on what we see as our early revenue forecast for next year. We had the benefit of the governor's recent budget proposal, and we most importantly want to reaffirm the board's budget priorities because we're getting ready to go to work with your budget advisory committee in January. So this first slide here, just a quick timeline. We had the State Board of Education budget come out. It was pretty modest. It was a 1.12% increase overall, $50 to the BSA, and then the main highlight was there was $25 million more statewide for mental health. The legislature got their long-range financial outlook from EDR in September, and it was fairly bleak. What it told them was they had enough money to meet their high demands and critical needs for the upcoming FY21 year, but in years 2 and 3 of the forecast, it appeared revenue was going to be short of budget demands. So it's, and then there's a lot of concern about where the economy is going as a whole and potential recession and slowdown. So it's kind of a gloomy forecast. It looks like at least 1 year out, we're looking okay. The governor's budget came out. I'm going to talk more about the percentages, and we know the legislature is going to start early in January. I always like to remind the public, this board well knows, you don't have a whole lot of say in determining your revenue. The legislature they set our tax rates by statute, and they set the required local effort each year when they adopt their budget, and that's been a big budget driver. I'm going to talk a little bit about more. Fortunately, in Palm Beach County, we had 2 big problems. We lost 25% of our capital improvement millage, and we went to the voters in 2016, and they helped us out with the 1 penny sales tax, which is working wonderfully. The revenues are coming in currently above forecast, and it's filling its purpose. And then the 1 mill levy was critical after years of having our RLE rolled back. We really needed that 1 mill to improve teacher salaries and meet our safety and mental health needs in the fine arts programs. Sometimes we get the question, we hear Palm Beach County is a donor district. That's true. When it comes to education and the FEFP, if you look statewide, the state supports 57% of the FEFP through state general revenue, which is primarily the 6% sales tax. In Palm Beach County, it's kind of inverted. We get less state money because we have a strong tax base. So when they set the RLE, they look to see what that will generate in each county. And then when they approve the budget, they're really approving a funding amount per student. And then you fill that gap with state revenue to get you to the state-approved level. And because we have a strong tax base in Palm Beach County, we're a 61% local, 39% state split. If you factor in the 1 mill levy that's now in place, the local sources goes up to 66%, supported by our local taxpayers. And the legislature is going to be tackling their almost $91 billion budget. The FEFP, if you look at the state's portion of the FEFP, it's at $12.5 million, or 13.77% of the whole big budget they're wrestling with. We did look back. We looked back 20 years to see if that percentage had shrunk or grown where it's going to education. It has shrunk a little bit, 0.44%, which doesn't sound like much, but that equates to $400 million less. Just looking at that, what share is K-12 education garnering of the state budget? And then our own budget, our big pie chart here, just to provide some context, we've got a $2.1 billion operating budget. 75% of that really goes directly to our schools, both district schools, charter schools, and then the referendum now reflects 10% of our budget, and all that money is essentially in our schools. Departments are at 8%. That includes transportation, some of school police, some big departments. So we've stayed pretty lean. I've seen our department budgets kind of they were 9% a few years back, so we've kept that in check. There's some other money that's really in schools, but we track it separately, like the VPK and the adult ed programs and the SAC program. We've got that's about 4% of the budget. We've got 2% what we call set-asides for school budgets, and that's money that gets doled out throughout the school year. And then you can see, utilities, our contingency reserve, of course, we've kept it at 3%. But that really breaks down our whole big budget. And this is a really telling slide if you want to look at where we've been and where we might be heading with our funding. Each year the legislature adopts a budget and you hear things like it's historic or it's more money than ever, for education. And you really have to sort through it and say, okay, what did we really get as a per student increase? And from FY17 to FY19, we received 1%, 1.39%, 1.39% again. And then FY20 we did a little bit better, but they played tricks with us a little bit. They said it was an over 3% budget because they moved the best and brightest into the FEFP. So that was $284 million they put in FY20 only, and they didn't show best and brightest in the prior year, and it really skewed that year-over-year increase. When we truly look at, you take best and brightest out of the equation, it drops to 1.92%. And if you take some of the other categoricals, it will drop to 1.62%. So it was a little better, but still under 2%. And then looking ahead for FY21, I mentioned the state board request of 1.12. If you look at the finances of the long-range outlook, it looks like it could support about a 2% increase. And then we've got the governor at just under 4%, with a big part of that, most of that money going to teacher salaries in two different ways, through the starting salary and through a replacement of the Best and Brightest bonus program. Just to break that down a little further, the
Mike,
other thing
Mike,
yes,
Spurgeon,
sir.
Let me ask you a question. So the State Board of Education, which is supposed to support the public schools in the state, they're recommending that we only get a 1.12% increase. So it's not the legislators, it's the State Board of Education that's actually wants to put the squeeze on us?
So it's a really interesting dynamic, and I'm glad you asked, because I have a version of the slide that's...
Did I ask it exactly the way you told me to?
Yes, I was not smart enough to set this up, but what's really interesting, if you looked at FY17, FY19, we had Richard Corcoran was Speaker of the House, and he really drove education budget policy. He started the rollback of the RLE, and we had these 1% increases. FY20, he was out of the equation for a year as he transitioned into Commissioner of Education. So I'm not really surprised that we see now with him as the commissioner that we're seeing these a 1.12% increasement. There's been like a tightening. There's now alignment between his old job as Speaker of the House and Commissioner of Education. That's why I think we got this much more modest request. If you go back further, like even before Commissioner Corcoran's arrival, the state board would usually ask for like 3 or 4%. We never received it, but it would be at a high water mark, and then we'd wait to see what the governor did. Now we're seeing, things kind of align closer with the leadership that's in place.
Thank you.
Thanks. In the old days, we used to look at general revenue, state general revenue, and see how that was growing, what percent that was growing each year, and we'd hope that education would grow with it. So that's the blue line you see there, where from 17 to 19 it was growing, 4 to 7% per year. FY20, that dramatic drop, that reflects the loss of the Seminole gaming money, about $350 million that fell off the table. So the revenue didn't really go up in 20, and then it recovers in the out years. The governor's budget still does not bank on the Seminole gaming money. They've yet to reach a deal. So right now the legislature, I don't think, is planning on working that $350 million back into the budget. On an unrelated note, they did open a beautiful hotel that's shaped like a guitar down there in Broward County. So they seem to be doing pretty well. The other two lines on this chart show you the green is our increase in student funding each year. So you see our history there in the 1% range and up to almost 2% in FY20. And then going outwards here, if we were going to just follow where we think the financial outlook is, that would be our forecast. But that remains to be seen. The red line just shows you inflation. And you can see our funding really hasn't kept up with inflation, or it's right at the inflation level. So that's why it continues to be a challenge. Florida has now fallen. We were 30th in the country if you go back to 1990. We're now 45th in the country in terms of funding per student, and we continue to slide. This, I've got to give Ms. Knus credit. She's the closest thing we have to a Las Vegas handicapper now with forecasting our revenue, and she's found a very strong correlation in what happens with required local effort. Basically aligns pretty closely with what happens with our increase in student funding. Property values is the blue line of the chart, where it's grown from 7.5% to over 5% each year. That delta between the blue line and the green line of our student funding, That's the difference between us and the county government and the cities across Palm Beach County. You know, when the property values grow, they have the flexibility to maintain their millage rate and generate more revenue. We do not. We see our millage rate set by the legislature. And that, again, that was the impetus for our referendum. But this would be our forecast looking out. If we had to gamble on this, we would say, okay, best we can expect the next 3 years, probably about a 2% increase. And I think I've covered some of it. We have the EDR outlook. One big point I want to mention that we're watching closely is with the FRS. You may have read an article. They've done some actuarial studies, and they look at the projected rate of return on the pension fund. And the report found that really we should be banking on about a 6.5% rate of return for the pension fund. They currently use 7.4%, so that's high. There's talk of moving that down to a 7.2%, and just that modest tweak in the expected rate of return has a $233 million financial impact to the fund. So that means potentially employers would have to kick in another $233 million. If that plays out, our share of that could be as much as $17 million. Now, the legislature is not bound to follow the recommendations of the economists and the actuaries, but, hopefully they'll give it strong consideration. And I think we've covered the rest of this. The governor's proposal, again, what's exciting about the governor's proposal is whether you like the way or not he's going about it, there is potentially $900 million on the table for teacher salaries, and I'm glad to see that that's reached the point where it's getting some attention, because after years of seeing us slide to 45th in the country and seeing our RLE rolled back, it's about time. So hopefully, through our legislative efforts and with the help of the business community and everyone else, maybe we can help shape those programs, those proposals anyway, to really benefit all teachers. I think that about covers the outlook. I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Canoost and let her wrap up the rest of this presentation and give you a little more detail.
Okay, so we've been focusing on the statewide impact, so now we're going to shift to what is the impact of the governor's proposal to Palm Beach County. I do want to start that the governor's proposal compares to the second calculation. The third calculation, which is based on the actual FTE in October, is going to be released in December. So the House and the Senate proposals are going to be compared to the third calculation, so you will see a difference in the changes when we do those comparisons once the House and Senate proposals are released. You'll also see a change with the unweighted FTE because that will reflect the actual FTE as of October. So you will see a slight difference once we have those three comparisons in a month or so. But the governor's proposal is asking for or recommending a $50 increase in the base student allocation. He's assuming right now the district cost differential is going to stay the same. And that's for two reasons. I mean, first, the Florida Price Level Index has not been released yet. That's going to be released in January. And if you recall from the last legislative session, the Office of Economic Demographic Research was tasked by the legislature to come up with a new methodology for the DCD. And they were supposed to work with school districts and come up with a proposal by October 1st. Well, as of now, we have not seen a new proposed methodology. So we're going to be monitoring the legislative session to see whether there is going to be a change in the DCD or whether they're going to push it off for another year. So for right now, we're assuming that it's the same. So the only increase in the categoricals is within the mental health allocation. So it's a $25 million increase statewide. Our portion of it is $1.7 million. The rest is relatively unchanged. If you shift down, you can see the impact of the teacher compensation program, the proposal by the governor. Our portion of that $600 million, which is the program to increase the starting teacher salary to $47,500, our allocation would be $36 million, and that does include charter schools. They're also proposing to revamp the Best and Brightest program to the teacher and principal bonus allocation. And I moved the Best and Brightest allocation out of the FEFP categorical detail from the prior year just for comparison purposes. That program would be eliminated in order to fund this new bonus allocation. You can see that we received almost $20 million in FY20. The amount that we would be slated to receive in this new bonus program is about $18.5 million, which is actually less than we received for Best and Brightest. So you've had total state funding of $44.7 million. Moving on, we can see that our property tax roll is projected to increase by 5%. But the governor is proposing that we roll back the RLE with just allowing for the increase in new construction. We do expect that we will have some enrollment growth, but we are still working on those projections. But we are expecting that whatever that ends up being, that we will split that increase with the charter schools. So our net district funding that we're looking at is $53.2 million. Represents a 3.47% increase in per student funding, which is less than what it is statewide, because there are some other categoricals that we're not eligible to receive. If we back out that teacher compensation program, it's an actual increase of 1.27%, or $100. If we take a step further and back out the mental health, it reduces it further to 1.17. So $53 million seems like a lot of money, but it really goes very quickly. And so we have to start with the FRS employer contribution. That we don't have enough information to say what the impact is going to be next year. It's anywhere from no change at all up to $17 million. I do expect to something between $3 and $5 million because they're going to want to start to chip away at that large liability. We also have to back out the increase in the mental health because that's set aside for a specific purpose. And that's the same with the teacher compensation of $31 million. We then have to set aside a reserve to maintain our 3% contingency reserve. And even though we haven't settled for FY20, we know that we will be settling at some point, and we are going to have settlements that are effective as of January 1st. So we need to make sure that the next year's budget takes into consideration a full year's worth of expenses. And so we do have an estimate of $2 million. We do expect enrollment to increase. With increased enrollment, we will have increased staffing, so we have an estimate of $2 million. And then we always try to set aside a bargaining reserve that we know is not adequate, but at least equal to what our actual increase is from the state funding. And so that's estimated based on the governor's proposal of $12.7 million. And with that, we pretty much spent the whole $53 million. So we have other considerations. We do know that the property tax values are going to increase, which means that our referendum is going to increase by nearly $10 million, but it's already fully spent because we know that the teacher supplements are going to increase. We're going to be able to fully staff, finish filling all of the positions within the school police department, as well as the additional co-located service providers. And the governor's proposal, even though it is very positive, it does have some unintended consequences, which we'll cover quickly. And then we're also monitoring the enrollment trends throughout the state. So the cost of the governor's proposal is, in order to increase the pay to $47.5 for all teachers, is $28 million. And the issue that causes, although positive, the issue it causes, you're going to have brand new teachers that are making the same amount as teachers with several years of experience. So if we were to give a $6,500 increase to every teacher in the district, that would cost $96 million. If we were to take the actual raise, the impact of a $6,500 increase on the starting teacher salary equates to a nearly 16% raise. If we were to apply that to all teachers, that would cost $122 million, which is well above what we're actually going to be receiving, potentially with this new proposal. And so in monitoring, now moving on to enrollment trends in Florida, the chart on the left is depicting enrollment trends of neighboring districts, and it's showing the year-over-year trend or year-over-year change in enrollment, percentage change in enrollment. Palm Beach County is the top bar in the dark blue, and of our neighboring districts, comparing ourselves to Miami-Dade, Broward, and Martin County, we're the only district that hasn't seen an actual declining enrollment. We've stayed above 0%. So in FY19, we had very minimal growth, but at least we had some growth. We do expect to see an uptick in FY20, just finalizing the FTE projections from the state. But you can see that Miami-Dade, Broward, and Martin have seen declining enrollment in the last couple years. And so that's something that we're continuing to monitor because normally that it starts in those counties and then it moves its way to Palm Beach County. The chart on the right shows enrollment trends in the large urban 7 districts across the state. You can see Broward and Dade where we have declining enrollment. or Broward and Dade has declining enrollment, but you can see Hillsborough and Orange and Polk, although their enrollment is starting, their enrollment growth is slowing as well, they have much higher growth than we're seeing in our area. And so when the issue with looking at declining enrollment, the kids don't leave in one classroom in one school, they're scattered amongst the district, and so you're going to see a decline in revenue, but not a corresponding decrease in your expenditures. So we already talked about the DCD and where we stand with that. We're still waiting for methodology. As of now, EDR has not presented a proposed methodology. Moving on to the Family Empowerment Scholarship, there were 18,000 scholarships that were available to be awarded in FY20. This was the first year of the program. All of them were awarded. Of those, 2.5% represented students from district-operated as well as charter schools. In FY21, the number of scholarships available is around 7,000. So if we were to have the same proportion, or 2.5%, that's approximately 200 students could be coming from Palm Beach district-operated and also charter schools. So we're continuing to monitor what that impact of the Family Empowerment Scholarship would be. In looking at other legislative bills that have been passed in previous years that still have an impact on us, House Bill 7123, that's where we're required to share any operating millage referendum with the charter schools. So subject, if there's no change, we're going to have to share our referendum dollars. House Bill 7055 requires school districts to make up any shortfall of the charter school capital outlay funding. The governor's proposal is proposing to fully fund that charter school capital outlay. So districts potentially, as of right now, depending on what ends up getting approved, wouldn't have to make up that shortfall. Then we have Senate Bill 360, which is requiring districts to set aside or make sure that they spend 80% of their funds on classroom spending. This bill was proposed last year. It didn't go anywhere. It has been filed again. But when you're looking at an 80% criteria, the bill is not specific as to what is included within classrooms. So if you look at our FY19 actual expenses, you can see that we spent nearly 70% within Function 5000, which is instruction and classroom spending. But classroom support is a large part of the budget, and student support services includes items such as guidance counselors and school psychologists. So important mental health services, direct services that are provided to students that potentially would not be included within that 80%. So the proposed budget priorities for the board next year, we want to always align the budget to the strategic plan as well as the long-term outcomes, and continue to be good fiscal stewards of taxpayer dollars. So this is our first budget workshop of the year. The regular session convenes in January. We'll continue to have budget advisory committee and budget workshops throughout the year. Tentative budget adoption is scheduled for July 29th, and final budget adoption is scheduled for September 9th. And so with that, we can open it up for any questions.
Questions? Mrs. Whitfield?
Thank you. 2 questions. The 80% you're talking about, does that include referendum funds in that, or is it just funds that come from the state?
We're still waiting for more clarification as to what would be included within that 80%.
Okay, I think that's going to be the same answer for my next question, which is about the funding that we're potentially going to get from the governor for teacher salary. Is that something that we would be able to negotiate with the teachers on how it's allocated, or is it just going to come to us and say, this is how much we get? I'm thinking you don't know the answer to this either, but I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on how it comes to us.
I mean, it's an excellent question. We went through this with Governor Scott years ago, where he allocated about $480 million to teacher pay. We ultimately negotiated those increases, but the governor attempted to be pretty prescriptive.
Yeah.
But there are collective bargaining laws that kind of protect that process. So I guess we can't really give you a strong answer here today. We're kind of anxious to see what that looks like.
Yeah, so maybe after for our next
There's already been a bill
workshop.
filed, I think, by Senator Diaz trying to put more flexibility behind that proposal. where like if you're already closer to 47.5 and you have less distance to go there, that would free up money to be used for veteran teachers and things like that. So,
Yeah.
but we'll have to see. You know, they've been pretty prescriptive with best and brightest, and we don't have any latitude there to make changes.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you both.
Thank you.
Take us to the Ed Foundation Annual Report.